Welcome back to a day of courage, a national day of courage, which is the anniversary, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks. I'm here with Jeanne Theoharis, who is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York, but also the author of a new book called The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks.
Right.
Welcome to Detroit.
Thank
or I
you.
should say welcome back to Detroit. You actually had to spend a lot of time in Detroit to write this book.
Absolutely, because Rosa Parks spends more than half of her political life here in Detroit. She comes to Detroit in '57, right? And then she dies in 2005. So, I mean, Rosa Parks' story is as much a Detroit story as it is a Montgomery story.
As it is a Montgomery story. And I don't think people necessarily think of it that way because they tend to think of her only as a seamstress who stood up or didn't want to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery. But she was really much more than that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we focus too much on one day, one act, when it really is, I mean, a life of courage, right, that we're honoring today, and that I think I try to sort of show in my book kind of a lifetime of kind of political work and resistance, right, that really begins with her family and her mother and her grandparents, and then lasts all the way really till she dies in 2005.
Right. And talk about the nature of that work. It was much more radical than people would maybe perhaps like to believe that it was.
Absolutely. And what it took to do what she did, right, and to go against sort of, the kind of prevailing ideas, but also the kind of systems of kind of violence and economic retaliation. Right? I mean, one of the things people don't necessarily realize is that Rosa Parks' bus arrest leads to a decade of economic instability for her family, leads to kind of health problems for her and her husband, right? That it is an extremely costly stand, and she had been making those stands for years beforehand. So this is, most of us don't have that kind of courage to do what that takes.
And the reason for that economic instability was.
So basically, 1 month into the boycott, she gets laid off.
She gets laid off.
And then her husband is working as a barber at the Air Force Base, and they basically say there can be no talk of the boycott or that woman in the shop. And he is Raymond Parks is a political man. When she meets him, she calls him the first real activist I ever met. He's working to free the Scottsboro boys, the 9 boys, 12 to 19, who are arrested riding the rails, and then the charge quickly turns to rape. They're sentenced to death. And so Raymond is one of those local activists who kind of come up to defend and try to work on the Scottsboro case. So she meets him. That's what he's doing. And so for a proud political man like Raymond Parks to be muzzled like that, and so he loses his job. So they spend the year of the boycott, they can't find work. I mean, he's barbering a little bit on the side, she's sewing a little bit on the side, but they never find work again in Montgomery. And even when they move here, right? This is not, she calls it the Northern Promised Land that wasn't.
Yeah, right.
That they really, they struggle, and I mean that, kind of, there is tremendous job discrimination in Detroit. There is, housing discrimination. There is school segregation, right? Many of the things that were in Montgomery are here in Detroit.
Right. And so things don't necessarily get better for them just because they move north, which is another sort of myth that I think we have about the civil rights movement, that things were somehow different in places like Detroit or Chicago. Dr. King talked, of course, very eloquently about that when he went to Chicago in the late 1960s.
I mean, so she works for John Conyers first. So John Conyers runs for Congress for the first time in 1964. He's a young civil rights lawyer, sort of a jobs, peace, and justice. He, like Rosa Parks, is an early opponent of the war in Vietnam. He's running. It's a crowded primary. It's a new seat. She volunteers for his campaign. She basically gets King to come on Conyers' behalf. Conyers wins that primary with less than 100 votes. So he very much credits her, among many factors, as what gives him that win. And so he hires her in 1965 to work in his Detroit office, and she's doing, particularly in those first years, a lot of kind of community work, a lot of constituent work, again, around the sort of problems of kind of northern segregation, poverty, housing, these kinds of things.
Right. And she continues that sort of close association with some of the more recognizable radical figures from that era. In fact, you were pointing to your book just before we came on the air. Your favorite picture of her is Rosa Parks and Stokely Carmichael.
Right, because I think it's it challenges the way we imagine her, right? And that in order to be who Rosa Parks is, right, then she keeps going, right? She keeps making these stands, and she admires people who make these stands. And so she meets Malcolm X 3 times. She calls Malcolm X her personal hero. He very much wants to meet her. He speaks so highly of her, right? So again, I think these blow our mind, right? Because it's not the way we think of Rosa Parks, but in many ways she was inspired by, worked with a whole variety of sort of black freedom fighters.
Right. I know you're a college professor now. I read an article that you wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about a student of yours who was accused of, I think, being a terrorist. And I thought, as I was reading the article, about the connection that you might see between the civil rights movement then and, you know, the fight for freedom in this country now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think part of what a kind of fuller look at Rosa Parks' life gives us is sort of what it takes to do that kind of work. And so, and absolutely, like, she believed the struggle continued, and in many ways, sort of part of how I come to this is both as an historian, but also as a kind of political activist myself, and, you know, and seeing that there are many issues that are still with us.
Right, right. When you were writing this book, what was the thing that for you surprised you the most to learn about Rosa Parks?
I mean, I think there were a couple of things. I think one of the things was just that there wasn't a scholarly footnoted biography of her. I mean, that she's, you know, arguably one of the most important Americans of the 20th century, and yet, you know, there was not a kind of footnoted biography.
There's not a lot of great scholarly work around her.
Yes.
For some reason.
Yes. And so that was surprising.
Is that something that has an explanation?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that I critique in my book is the way that sort of simultaneously she has been tremendously honored and given, I think, our nation's top honors, but in many ways pigeonholed. It's sort of like a children's book hero, and somehow we think we know her, and we think there's not much more to know. And so I think so many people, so many historians, when I would say, like, I'm working on a book on Rosa Parks, they'd be like, and then I would say, well, you know, there's not a scholarly biography of her, and they'd be like, astonished.
How could that
possibly be? They didn't believe it, right? You know, I mean, I think but I do think it speaks to the kind of way she's an icon, but again, put in a kind of very narrow box, and I think we need to kind of free her from that.
Right. Also, in the article you wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, you talked about the government suspicion of these movements and sort of how that carries forward, not just from the civil rights movement, but now to spying on Arab Americans and Muslims, assuming that there is automatically a connection with terrorism. So that the struggle in that sense continues.
And I mean, I think one of the things people don't realize is Rosa Parks is red-baited. She's called a communist for, you know, really the better part of 2 decades, right? King is called a communist for the better part of 2 decades. And they're called a communist not just in the South, but here, here in Detroit, right?
Sure.
And for supporting things like desegregated schools, desegregated housing. These are seen as sort of they're un-American, they're against our way of life, right? And so I think there is unfortunately a long history of surveilling people who are sort of
that continues through the Vietnam
era, and that unfortunately
the Cold War era,
and then continues today.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being in Detroit, and thank you for writing the book.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely.